What is going on, everybody? This is Tanner here with the Vision Project. I am so blessed that you have joined us for another edition of the VP Podcast. You are in for a treat today because we have Cliff Carey, the former Hume Lake Christian Camp's director, as well as my old youth pastor. I can't even tell you, and I don't even know where to begin with being able to tell you how special this man is to me. I am so honored that he is joining us today to share a very, very heartfelt story. And as we go through this season of focusing on loss and what it means to really deal with loss as believers, even as unbelievers, how you can find hope in the midst of a time of dealing with loss. This is a story that is going to touch you. And I know that it is because I know Cliff's heart. I know his character and who he is, and also just what he has told me about this testimony and what I know about it is absolutely incredible. I'm so honored that he is willing to share this, and I'm excited for you guys to hear what he has to say and the knowledge that he has to share. Again, Cliff, if you're listening, I'm so blessed that you have joined us today and that you are willing to share this testimony. I'm also just so glad and honored that I get to have you as a brother in Christ and somebody who built me up as a young believer in high school when you were my youth pastor, somebody that discipled me, and man, so many countless memories that I will never forget. So let's hit that intro. Let's get into the episode, shall we? Let's go. Welcome to the Vision Project, a place where we strive to give hope and understanding of who Jesus is. We hope today's episode guides you to a better understanding of who he is and how much he loves and cares for you. Have a wonderful day. Alrighty, we are live, we are ready, and I've got my brother here, Cliff Carey. Cliff!
Tanner!
How you doing?
I am doing so well. I love this. This is so cool.
This is awesome that we get to do this. I was on yours and now you're on mine.
That's right. We just get to trade off.
Yeah, so with that being said, why don't you, let the people know who you are, what your ministry is, or ministries, I should say. Go ahead and explain that to us.
Yeah. So my name is Cliff Carey, as you said. I am the executive pastor at Sunrise Community Church in Fair Oaks. That's in the Sacramento area here, and have been there for almost 8 years. I had the distinguished privilege of being Tanner's youth pastor. So there we have that. And got to see him when he wasn't as mature as he is today. But in all seriousness, I was youth pastor at Sunrise for 3 years, and then became the executive pastor. And for those that don't know what an executive pastor does, I oversee more of the business side and the personnel side of the church. So where the senior pastor is responsible for vision and direction and preaching and things like that, I oversee more of the operations side of the church. So it's a real fun position. And then when COVID hit, our church started looking for more ways that we could reach out to people, especially during the big quarantine. Mm-hmm. And that's when I started the Monday morning backshed Bible study from my shed in my backyard, because that had become my my office during COVID lockdowns. And so we started doing a Facebook Live Bible study that kind of turned more into an interview show / Bible study, and then we've launched the podcast version of it this year, and put it on YouTube and all those kind of fun things. So it's a lot of fun what I get to do over here in my shed.
And you're in your shed right now.
I'm in my shed right now. It's shed / studio. If I had known 3 months earlier when I built the shed that it was going to be my office / studio, I would have insulated it. Let me just tell you that.
There's no returning now.
No. So I got to deal with cold and hot and everything in between.
Yep.
It's a lot of fun.
you're dealing with it and you're going through it and pushing through. And I love the podcast. I love, seeing all the different people that you've had on. You've had Rachel on and, other
Yeah.
special people. It's just been, very fruitful. Love seeing, the live feed and seeing people, hop on. So if any of you in my audience are listening, go ahead and check that out. That's on Monday mornings, right?
That's right. Monday mornings at 10 o'clock on Facebook Live. You just search Sunrise Community Church and you'll come up with our Facebook page, and that's where we are. Or you
So
can
awesome.
watch later, other episodes. Just go to YouTube and search Backshed Bible Study, and we're all over the place from there.
Awesome. So cool. So Cliff, to inform you, in this season at the Vision Project, we've been going through this subject of loss. And I know that you
Yes.
yourself have dealt with significant loss in your life.
Yeah.
And that's, kind of why we're here today. We're here to hear your story. So I would love if you would, and I'm honored first and foremost that you're, willing to come on the show and share that. So the floor is yours, sir.
Yeah, absolutely. And honestly, Tanner, I appreciate any opportunity I have to be able to share April's and my story of loss, and how that has played out in our lives over the last 11, almost 12 years.
Mm,
So I'll take you back about 12 years. My wife and I, lived and worked at Hume Lake, great place up in
so
the mountains
cool.
of Central California. And at the time, I think we'd been married about 5 years, and we had two kids. Our son Peter, who at the time was 2, and our daughter Elise, who was around 11 months old. And um, it was a winter weekend. I remember very clearly. It was February 14th, so Valentine's Day. Camp was full. I think there were 700 to 800 kids in camp that weekend for a winter camp. And my daughter Elise had she had just gotten a real bad. At first, we thought it was a cold, but it kind of turned into this croup, kind of nasty
Mm,
cough that she had. And we took her to see a doctor up there at Hume Lake, because they bring doctors up on the weekends to deal with campers.
mm,
And he looked at her and said, she's probably past the worst of this, and so on. Well, it just got worse and worse and worse. And I believe it was a Sunday night, and it was back in 2010. And she just wasn't getting any better, and the cough was getting worse, and she was getting really irritable. And it just, my poor wife April had made us an amazing Valentine's Day dinner, and special time for our family. But we were dealing with Elise and trying to get her calmed down, and just get her some
mm,
sleep, because she just hadn't been sleeping.
mm,
And I finally was able to get her down to sleep that night late, probably 11 to 12 o'clock, and
mm,
we went to bed. And just something prompted me to get up about 4:30, 4:45 in the morning. And I walked in her room to check on her, as I often do, because she typically, at the age, she was 10 and a half months at the time.
mm,
And at that age, she was not sleeping all night, so it was pretty normal for me to get her a bottle, and hang out with her for about a half hour in the middle of the night. And
mm,
I went in to check on her, and I realized very quickly something was wrong. And as I turned her over, she was not breathing, and just completely still. And immediately, I mean, I yelled over to April and started calling 911. I started CPR, and
mm,
um, we got dressed and raced down to the infirmary there at Hume, which is not far from where we lived at the time. and
mm.
and woke a doctor up out of bed and got him over there. And I mean, and he just immediately, the moment he got there with her, he just said, "I am so sorry she's gone." And I mean, I'll never forget April at that moment. I mean, literally collapsing in my arms on the floor. And we were stunned. By this point, it's 5:15 in the morning, and
Mm,
we're trying to process what's happening here, and you're in complete disbelief at what has happened.
Mm.
So um, in in a short amount of time, some of our closest friends started to find out. They started to get phone calls, and started to show up to be there for us. And you know my good friend Jay,
Mm-hmm.
who got over there as quickly as he could
Mm.
and was with us. But it began just a hard, dark season in our lives. And suddenly, at this point, right up to this point, Tanner, we kind of had the thought that we were living just this perfect life.
Mm.
We I had a great job. We were in a great ministry together there at Hume Lake.
Mm.
Here we have two kids that are, all of 20 months apart and 19 months apart, actually, and it was a great setup, and
Mm.
it looked like, okay, God's blessing is on our family, and then suddenly we start walking through the um, just the darkest thing any parent could go through,
Right.
and that's where we were. So um, I'll leave it there for now. Let you ask more questions, but
Mm.
that is what happened, and
Sure.
there's a whole lot more as we kind of walk through and talk through what it looked like for us to grieve and um, deal with the loss of a young child and everything that went with that.
Sure. Yeah. And, along with that, whole grieving process and, you know, even just processing in itself, how does one, and even for you as somebody who's working at a Christian camp, is a strong believer in the Lord, is serving the Lord in his ministry, how do you process something like that? What does that grieving process look like for somebody who believes in God and believes that he has the will, the plan, and that he's on the throne? What does that look like for a Christian?
Excellent question. It is, as much as you would like to think there was some uh, book, the strategy book that's been written about how to grieve and to walk through that. There just isn't. There are lots of books written, but
Lost for
grief
dummies.
is right. Yeah, grief is so different for every single person,
Mm.
and uh, for us, here you are, and I, both April and I had been Christians since we were young children,
Mm.
and so we grew up with foundational belief in God and understanding. And I had gone to a Christian college, and so I had a Christian education that taught me all of the right things to believe.
Mm.
But this is where it stands out to me is suddenly now you have all of the head knowledge, but the heart knowledge is being put to the test. and
Mm.
and I'll never forget when we walked back from that infirmary that morning, just an hour later after we'd gone through all of this, and we had to walk back to our house, which was, all of 100 yards or something. It wasn't that
Mm.
far away. But as we're walking back without our daughter in our arms, uh,
Mm.
and we got to our house, and people are starting to come over, there's this moment where on that walk where it just very simply came to my mind, either everything that we have been studying and believing with our minds till this point, biblically, is true, or it isn't.
Mm.
If it's true, then in the end, it is going to be okay. And I was able to logically say that to myself that morning. If this is all true that we've been believing, it's going to be okay. If this is not true, then we might as well close the blinds to the house, close the blinds on the windows, and shut the house and go into um, self pity and everything, and turn the lights off. We're done.
Mm.
It really was that. Either if it's true, It's going to be okay. If it's not true, then we're done.
Mm.
And clear as day, we knew that it was true. That said, in what I said at the beginning, we entered into some of the darkest times of our life.
Sure.
Deep, painful grief, not
Mm.
being able to sleep, questioning, and still questioning God, for sure. But we all the way along knew God's in control. And even during this time, and Tanner, you will probably remember this as having been someone in my youth group,
Right.
that there were three things that I always said about God. God is good, God is faithful, and God is sovereign.
Mm.
And those three things just became the truth that I would repeat day after day after day. God is
Right.
good, God is faithful, God is sovereign.
Right.
And repeating those things was even part of the healing in the midst of the grief.
Mm. Mm. That's good. I mean, it's not easy for any of us to deal with grief, to deal with the process of even death itself. It's something really difficult for us to face. But looking at it in the face, looking at this whole entire, trial in the face of it, now you're able to look back. So for you, what were some of the things that you wish you knew prior to facing this loss?
Oh, boy, maybe I do wish you had prompted me on a few of these questions ahead of time. No, that's a good one. I don't know if I wished I had known anything ahead of time. I think there was so much of God's grace
Mm.
that was showering over me.
Mm.
Maybe the best thing though, it was something that a counselor told April and me
Mm.
um, a couple of weeks into it. I think maybe 3 weeks into it, we went to see this counselor, and we were doing it for the sake of our son because she specializes in child development and so on.
Mm.
And we go to see her, and our biggest thing was we don't want to screw up our son. Like,
Mm.
we want him to grow up and have a normal life and not be
Right.
messed up by his parents and in this trauma. But I'll never forget, she looked at us, both of us, and said, "You need to be kind to yourselves."
Mm.
And that was such a freeing moment that that she gave us permission
Mm.
to be messy. She gave us permission to not have our act together.
Yep.
She gave us permission to be able to deal with people that would say stupid things in a way that was helpful for us and all that. So, if anything, going into it, I think it's just important for anyone to know, first off, like, you're going to have hard times in your life.
Yeah.
If you haven't already, you will.
Mm.
And to be okay with the fact that those hard times will come
Mm.
and they will be hard. You might say some things that you wished you hadn't said to God,
Mm.
but He's a big boy. He can handle it. Um, he really can. Um, and so that's probably one of the better things, that just wishing I'd known that that it's normal, and and it's okay to go through the hard parts of it.
Mm. That's good. No, and I mean, and that's what we do have to do as Christians, is know that there are times to come where we will face these trials, we will face difficulty, because if we don't, it's really like neglecting the fact that there is armor to put on before battle, that there is, war to get ready to be prepared for. And so, it's even moments like this where it seems like the hardest parts of the battle are facing us. And did you feel like you were ready for a moment like that? Looking back
No,
now?
no. I think it's impossible to be ready or even to plan for every single circumstances.
Yeah.
What the thing that made April and me ready was the fact that we did have a fundamental understanding of the character of God.
Mm.
and because of that, and it's like I go back to that moment where we said either it's true or it's not.
Mm-hmm.
But because of that, understanding the character of God, we were able to understand that He was sovereign
Mm.
and it was going to be okay. Like
Yeah.
that was a really big thing.
Mm. Definitely. So next question.
All right.
What is your advice to the person that is dealing with loss?
Yeah. My advice to the person dealing with loss is I would start with allow the people that are around you to love you and to take care of you.
Mm.
Don't try to figure this out on your own because you can't.
Mm.
This one is beyond you. There's a beautiful story in the New Testament, and it's this man who's paralyzed, and his buddies carry him to Jesus. They can't get through the crowd, so they dig through a roof and they lower him to Jesus to get healed.
Mm.
And there are a couple of real simple truths in this story. One of them is, first off, he couldn't get himself to Jesus, right?
Right.
Um, and I look back to our time in our loss, we couldn't. There were times where we truly couldn't get ourselves to Jesus.
Mm.
April and I both would say I couldn't pray. It was almost impossible to pray. If I was sitting there holding my Bible, I had no clue where to go.
Mm.
Even though I was graduated from a Bible college and have all this education,
Mm.
it was I didn't know where to go in that moment.
Mm.
Uh, and so that this guy can't get himself to Jesus. His buddies carry him to Jesus. Now notice also that his buddies can't heal him. But they do know who can.
Mm.
And so they carry him to Jesus because they know that Jesus is the one who can heal him.
Mm.
And so for April and me, we had some incredible friends. And in that they were the ones that I almost could literally say carried us to Jesus.
Mm.
They would, if we left our house for several hours, we'd come back and our house was clean. And they'd gone through and cleaned our house. And then we'd find Bible verses hidden around the house, even laminated ones in the shower.
That's awesome.
I'd find verses hidden in the coffee cabinet in our kitchen.
Mm.
That it's like God's mercies are new every morning, right there with your coffee.
Mm.
And so it was just this really cool thing to allow them to carry us to Jesus.
Mm.
And we knew they were praying for us, but they were also doing a lot of tangible things for us. So my big advice to anyone that's going through loss is let the people that love you, that are around you, let them help you, let them carry you.
Mm.
They want to help and they don't know how to help.
Right.
This one was a pretty big thing. We have a good friend, her name's Jen, and Jen makes the most amazing cinnamon rolls ever. And Jen was over at our house that morning. She was there very quickly, and she is still one of our just dear friends. She and her husband Joel are dear friends to this day. But they're over at our house, and Jen very much is one of these people that is able to converse and talk and see where help needs to happen. And had jumped in and was helping with some things in our house. And her husband Joel was great. He looked at me and goes, "Cliff, I have no clue what to say, but I am here with you." And he was like Job's buddies before they were idiots, and would just sit with me. And he's like, I'm not going to say anything. I'm just going to sit here. I'm like, that's perfect. I just need someone in proximity. But I remember looking at Jen. It was the day Elise died. And I just said, Jen, I need some of your cinnamon rolls. and, and she starts kind of tearing up. She's like, I can do that. I can do that. And she went and made us cinnamon rolls. And we had them the next morning with breakfast. It was amazing.
Wow.
So sometimes, for someone that's just in the midst of it, let the people around them love them and carry them through it, and know they're not alone. They are absolutely not alone. They feel alone, and grief is going to be really hard. It is going to be dark and hard, and it's going to be very real. And they're going to encounter every emotion. But I would go on to say, don't be afraid to lean into grief. I think a lot of times, when you see someone crying, what do?
Usually we go over there and try to stop them. They're crying.
Right? Yeah. Hand them a tissue.
Yeah.
Here's the tissue to help control your crying, or, the results of your crying.
Sure.
Sometimes we have to grieve, and we have to go through that just hard, gasping, convulsing grief, because in the end, it is so cathartic. It is, being able to release those things and those emotions and that pain ultimately will lead to your healing. But the person that hides those things or holds them back and doesn't release those things, believe me, they're going to hold on to them. They are going to hold on to them, and they will come out a year later, 5 years later, 20 years later, and it's going to be ugly. So that's a big one too, is learning how to grieve well, and that's a whole nother rabbit trail we can go down.
I mean, we can go down it. Like for you, what were some, I guess you can give us some examples. What were some healthy ways you grieved? What were some moments that they were the ugliest moments? Like, what did that look like for you?
Yeah. So the healthy part of grieving is, for me, it was, go out in the woods and yell and scream and cry. And it was just painful. But to release that, my friends, Rich and Jay, the day that we lost her, I was sitting out in front of my house with the two of them, and I looked at both of them. I said, "Don't let me get fat. Whatever you do, don't let me get fat." So there's the unhealthy thing. The unhealthy thing is to go and eat and do what feels good,
right,
but doesn't necessarily have the best result. The healthy thing, and actually I didn't get fat, I actually lost a ton of weight in a very healthy way, is immediately, even that day, the day it happened, April and I, it was winter time at Lake, which means temperatures are hanging out in the 30s and 40s. There's snow everywhere. And we kind of looked at each other and said, let's go for a walk. Wow. So we go for this walk. And we end up walking probably 2 miles, 2.5 miles. And we came back and we're like, okay, that was good. We needed to do that. Well, that became a very regular habit. We started doing that every day, maybe a couple of times a day. Pretty soon she started jogging, and I started jogging again. And pretty soon she says, well, there's this half marathon going on in San Diego in May. I want to do it. And I'm sitting there thinking, oh my goodness gracious, it's crazy. You realize that is 13.1 miles, right, babe?
Oh my gosh.
So I said, okay, fine, I'll do it. And this is February. So we start training for this half marathon, and I would find out later through counseling that this was the best move we could have made.
Wow.
In the grieving process, because exercise, and specifically, running and things that are really getting your heart moving is creating endorphins, and so it is a catalyst for you to feel better, literally to feel better. Um, and so we are going out there, we're exercising every day, we're starting to lose a little bit of weight, but you're just feeling better because you're doing that. And so that was a big part. But the other, and Tanner, I think this is probably the most important thing I could share with anybody about it. And that is that we learned how to lean into the hard. There's a book that we ended up reading, and it's called A Grace Disguised. And the name of the author is I don't remember his name right now, but we read this book. I think his name's Jerry Sitter or Sidster or something like that. But great book. The guy is a pastor who had lost his family in a car accident.
Wow.
And I mean, just everyone. And so as we're reading this, you're just a mess as you're hearing his story and thinking, we just lost our daughter. He lost everything. But he keeps describing a dream, a recurring dream that he was having. And in this dream, he was chasing after the sunset, and he would never catch up to the sunset. At one point, and this is where I think began for him, and it's been 11 years since I've read this book, so forgive me if I'm really blowing the description of it. But at one point he realizes, and I think this is the obvious thing, is you can never catch the sunset. And he realized, if I turn toward the darkness, I will get to the sunrise sooner.
Oh, wow.
Right?
Wow. Mind blown.
So, right. It's so profound. And for us, that meant we have to lean into the hard things and go through those hard things, because if we do, the healing will happen sooner. So here's a perfect example of one. My wife is the most amazing cook / decorator / like we had this really wealthy guy come into our house one time, and he says, "This looks like a Pottery Barn showroom. This is amazing." Like just the way it was all decorated and all that. I mean, and so every little detail done in our daughter's room, the color, the walls were painted, the pink walls, and the crib, and the way everything was laid out, and all the things on the wall. And she says to me, and this was, I don't know, maybe 2 or 3 weeks after Elise had died. I think it was shortly after her funeral. And April says, "I think we need to paint her room. I think we need to make that no longer her room." And so my father-in-law came up for the weekend, or for a couple of days, and so that meant I had to take apart the crib that she excuse me as I may lose it here. I had to take apart the crib that she slept in. I had to take apart the crib that she died in.
Wow.
And and screw by screw, taking that thing apart, and it was in really good condition. And it truly was a second funeral for me, as I was just bawling my head off as I was taking this thing apart. And then we moved the furniture out of that room, and then my father-in-law and I painted the room. And we took it from the just beautiful soft pink color that was there, that was just a little girl's room, and painted it a neutral color. It would become Peter's room.
Wow.
And we moved Peter into that room, and made the extra room the room that Peter had been in. And as painful as that was, it was so necessary. We truly leaned into the darkness. We turned and we walked into the darkness, into the pain. And what that did is it said, we're not giving up on her. We're not erasing her memory, because, believe me, we had pasted pictures of her all over the house. We had frames, and suddenly every picture we could have of her was all over our house. We weren't going to lose her memory. But she no longer lived with us. She no longer resided with us. She resides with Jesus. And I've known parents that have left the room intact that their baby died in for 5 years.
Wow.
And that is incredibly unhealthy. And somehow we had the presence of mind to do that. And it was such, I can't say that it was cathartic at the moment, but in the end, it was maybe one of the best things we ever did. And that was when we started to adapt a phrase: you don't move on, but you move forward.
Right. Right.
And, you don't get over it. And I remember someone said, well, look, you're starting to get over it. I'm like, no, that's awful. No, you never get over it.
Oh my gosh.
When someone cuts your leg off, you're going to walk with a limp. You have a prosthetic, and it might heal, to a certain extent and all that, but you're still going to walk with a limp.
You're more so getting used to it.
Yeah.
Than
absolutely.
You are getting over it.
Yeah, you don't get over it. But so that's big thing was turning into the darkness. And the hard thing, the scary thing about turning into the darkness is you don't see the light for a while. But one day, and we started to pray for glimmers of hope, that God would show us little glimmers of hope. And gosh, he started to do that in some really cool ways too.
Well, I think that is the perfect way to end off as we head into a short little break. Stay tuned. Audience, don't leave. Don't go anywhere. We've got some exciting things coming. Isn't this great so far? I love this, Cliff. I love it.
Oh, it's cathartic. Seriously, Tanner, even 11, 12 years later, it's cathartic to be able to talk about it.
Awesome.
I appreciate it.
All right, let's head into the break. All right, welcome back. Nice little break for you to go and do what people do on breaks.
Or I drank some coffee, Tanner.
You drank some coffee? That's good. That's really good, because we're going to be here for a long time, I think. We'll see. I could talk to you for hours, and we both know that. We both know that we could both talk to each other for hours.
Yeah.
So let's dig back into this and dig back into this, subject of with grief and everything. For you, I want to understand what was that thing that got you through? And I know the typical answer is Jesus, but like what element of Jesus, or even, something that influenced you to see the light, to see that there is the other side to this? What did that look like for you?
Yeah, it's something that I reflected on a little bit earlier, but it really was leaning into the goodness of God and seeing that never changes. His faithfulness, that his faithfulness never changes. And so as we started to get into Scripture more, and my wife just started, once you get past those initial few weeks and start opening the Bible, and at some point, I think maybe a month in, I started reading Job. I said, well, I feel like him, so I might as well read it. Beat myself up a little bit. But my wife started reading the Psalms, And one day she comes across, and it's somewhere in the 20s, and all the Bible scholars that follow along will know which one it is. But it says, I am convinced that I will see the goodness of God in the land of the living. And it's that moment when, for April in particular, where she says, I have hope. His scripture promised I'm going to see God's goodness. And so it was clinging to truth that we were pulling out of scripture. And then remembering things like, hey, I prayed that we would see glimpses of redemption. Because April asked me one day, she says, are we ever going to see God's redemption? Or are we just going to be called to be faithful? And the answer to that question was an answer that was haunting me, because my theology told me that we were going to be called to be faithful, that we might not see redemption while we're on this earth. But we were called to remain faithful. And if we became faithless, he would remain faithful, since he cannot deny himself, right?
Right.
But then, April comes across this verse in the Psalms that says, well, I'm going to see the goodness of God in the land of the living. And we said, well, maybe we will see some of those glimpses of redemption, maybe not complete. So that was something big, is just clinging to that truth that the Bible promises and repeating it over and over and over.
Yeah.
So like I said earlier, I said, oh, God is good, God is faithful, God is sovereign, and just repeating it over and over and over,
Right.
and reading scriptures and studying scriptures. And then Job just slapped me across the face with God saying to Job in the end, where were you when? ...
Yep.
He starts going through all of the different ways that Job was not around at the creation of the earth and every single thing.
Right.
And I realized, you know what? The why question may never get answered. Why did God allow this to happen, right?
Yeah.
It's
the question.
It's the $100,000 question. It's the question everybody asks. Actually, it's inflation right now, so it's the $1 million question. But
That's funny. That's good.
Why, God? Why are you allowing bad things to happen to good people? And the answer was none of your business. You're not going to know, so stop asking.
Yeah. Stop asking questions that, I guess don't really matter in the long run.
Right. But, but I would never look at somebody who's just lost a child and say, well, you just need to trust God and not ask questions. You know what I'm going to do? I'm just going to shut up and love that person. But
Right.
But that eventually becomes part of that, is that unfortunately it's hard, is that question just never is going to get answered.
Yeah.
But you'll see
that's the
glimpses
striking
of it.
reality. Right.
Right.
Yeah.
So I got to tell you a story. So about 3 months after it happened, I had driven to Fresno to pick up a bunch of, the snow had melted at Hume, and it was time for spring planting to go. And my wife, her family are landscapers, and so they were giving us some shrubs and various flowers we could plant and so on. And so I drove down to Fresno in my little truck and picked up all these shrubs and these plants, and I drove them back up to Hume. And as I was driving through this area called Grants Grove, where it's a national park, so you have to drive the speed limit or they'll really get you, and it's 25-mile-an-hour speed limit. And as I'm driving down this road, I drop down to 25 right at the sign, and I see the National Park Service law enforcement that's parked on the side of the road with his radar gun. And I kind of went, well, it's a good thing I'm going 25. Well, this guy pulls out behind me, and follows me for the next 2 miles and then lights me up and pulls me over. So I'm sitting here going, I don't get it. So I pull over the side of the road, and the guy comes up to me very cautiously, and he's looking at me, and there's this moment where he kind of recognizes me because, you got to understand, we live up in the mountains, and we live 15 minutes away from where this guy lives. And so you see each other at various things that happen. And I'm like, hey, what's going on? He's like, well, you know what the speed limit is around here, right? I said, yes. And I was driving it. And he says, yeah, you were. He says, honestly, I pulled you over because I saw the shrubs in the back of a black truck with tinted windows, and you just kind of fit the profile. So I'm like, well, okay, I won't tell anyone. Well, yeah, now I'm telling thousands of people that a cop profiled me that day. But he thought I was like bringing marijuana plants to the mountains to grow. So once we kind of got over the laughter of that moment, and that he's like, yeah, I've seen you at Hume Lake. I know who you are. And he says, hey, how are things going down at Hume? And oh man, I might cry telling this story. I said, it's been a tough season. And mind you, this is 3 months after we'd lost Elise. He says, how are things going down at Him? It's been a tough season. He's like, yeah, I heard about the family that lost their child.
Oh my gosh.
And Tanner, I'm just like, that was me. And at that point, all filters were down, and he drops the F-bomb.
Oh my gosh!
I'm not quoting it for you today in your audience, but he just let it out. He's like, "I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry."
Oh my gosh! Out of all situations,
it was awesome.
Wow!
Because for the next 10 minutes, I got to tell him about the faithfulness of God in the worst ever possible season. And I drove home with a smile on my face, celebrating that God had used it.
Wow.
And that God had allowed me to talk to this guy in a way that I couldn't have otherwise. And there's just, honestly, there's story after story like that where God just used it in somebody else's life. And that became cathartic as well. When we started to see God using our story, I don't know that I would ever look back and say, oh, I'd go through all that again. It was worth it. But I can praise God because He remained faithful and He used it.
Yeah, I can tell you what, right now, just even for myself, when I was a high school student, and I just remember hearing that, that story for the first time I think at the time we were Crossroads high school group. I don't think it was 4-1 yet.
Yeah.
But, just sitting in that room, and I just remember I was just in this state of shock and awe, and I remember being so hyper-focused because of the seriousness of this story and the message that you were speaking of. You aren't promised tomorrow, and you're not even the next person, the person next to you, or the loved one, or that person that you just walked by. None of those people are promised tomorrow, and even yourself. So that gives you a sort of emphasis on how to live your life. And I was going to say, even for myself as a student, this story struck me in a way that, I remember the amount of emphasis it put on my life, of how important these relationships are. And, that's what loss does. It really allows you to reflect and process how important these relationships are, with these different people. So, yeah, I can tell you what,
huge.
It does, this story does change lives. And I'm sure you can go on for, such a long time explaining, how it's touched so many lives and how God's been able to use it. How do you feel personally? How do you feel God has used this story throughout these past 11 years, and how has that kind of even shaped your own way of thinking and living for yourself personally?
Yeah, it changes your perspective on everything. And that's probably one of the biggest things is you stop and you realize, all the stuff going on out there is not really that big. The things that we get all fired up about and worry about are just not nearly as big a deal as we make out of them. When you consider it, when you compare it, I should say, to Jesus Christ, who he is, that he's on the throne, that he's holding heaven and earth together, that he holds my daughter in his hands and his arms, and he comforts her in a way that's so much better than I can. I'll tell you what, it just gives you perspective. And even over COVID, that you just go, like all this stuff that we're all getting fired up all about on both sides is kind of noise.
Yeah.
It's noise compared to the surpassing knowledge of Jesus Christ and who he is and what he did on the cross. It stops you in your tracks and reminds you, focus on what matters the most, right? Focus on Jesus, because this other stuff is all peripheral.
Right.
And in losing my daughter, put my focus heavenward rather than on the stuff of this earth. Now, that said, over the last year and a half, have I been perfect in the COVID season and never gotten fired up about anything? Yeah, right.
In all of our dreams, right? In an ideal world.
Right, exactly.
Yeah. No, I mean, that it's so important for us to gain new perspective every day. And this is what I've told my students quite often is, as we look at our lives, it's so important daily to examine yourself, how you act, because you have to be aware of what your heart's desires. Your heart deceives you. It says that throughout Scripture. Your tongue is a powerful thing. How you use it, can either build people up or tear them down completely. And I'm sure for you, there were moments where you came across people that didn't use their tongue in the right way, or came across people that their actions and their tongue, helped build you up in that season. So, along with that, I would ask you this question, what advice would you give to the person that is surrounding the person in that pain as you experience both sides of the ball game?
Yeah. Okay. Excellent question, Tanner. Because, like we talked about earlier, I think most people, when they're around someone who's going through major grief, major loss, they don't know what to do.
Right.
So the first thing you do is you write that person's name down on a piece of paper and draw a circle around them. Okay. And then you put another circle around that circle. And you ask the question, who is in that next circle? Who are the people that are directly connected to that person? That could be family, very close friends. In my case, that was Jay. That was, in that second circle out was Jay. It was our friend Jen. Jay and his wife and Jen and her husband. There were close family, people like that. So those are those people in that next circle. So, in the inner circle, it's just me and April and Peter. That's it. So the way it works is the people that get to, oh boy, how do I say this right? The people that get the privilege of really being in those people's lives have to be in the next circle up. They can't be 3 or 4 circles out. And the thing is, when you go through tragedy like this, people 4, 5, 6 circles out are having compassion on you, and they're wanting to help. Right. And so they try to go all the way to the center circle. Well, they're not, in very few cases, are they really equipped to invest into that person in the center. So what we encourage people to do is connect with somebody that's in the circle that's closest to them and find out how you can help. But don't go straight to that person. So here's an example. There was this random dude that would come by my office probably once a week. And I barely knew this guy, but he knew, because we worked at Hume, because our story had become very high profile in the Hume world, everybody knew, lots of people were praying for us, and that was amazing. And lots of people gave us gifts, and lots of people asked to help. But there were people that were trying to fix the situation for us. And this guy was one of them. And so he stopped by my office and he gave me the CD of somebody speaking who had lost a child. And this guy was not connected to me. He wasn't even 3 circles connected to me. He was very distant off. And he would come back by my office every week and ask me if I had listened to the CD.
Oh, wow.
Finally, 4 weeks in, I looked him in the face and I said, "I'm sorry to be a jerk, but please stop coming by my office." And he's like, "Well, I was just trying to help." And I was like, "I'm sorry, I can't take this." And that was the end. But the lesson in there was, now, if he had gone to my friend Jay and said, "Hey, if there's ever an appropriate time, would you hand this to Cliff if this will fit?" And so I really encourage people, if you want to help, contact the people that are close to the people that it's affected. Find out how you can help. Find out how if there's a way you can encourage them. And sometimes it was, there was someone that was not connected to us, but that our friends knew that this person would be able to help us a lot because they had just gone through the same thing just a few months earlier.
Wow.
And so they went and they got that person and they brought him over to my house, and I have never experienced empathy like I did with that guy. And because he had lost his son, I think it was 5 months earlier, 6 months earlier. Wow. And he ended up being one of the guys that did her funeral. Because he and his wife got it. They understood. But yeah, so just be really cautious. Don't be afraid to send a gift. Don't be afraid to send a card. Actually, one of those things that you send in the mail, it's amazing. And it actually goes a little farther. Well, with people my generation, it goes a little farther than an email or a text. But really encourage people. If you sense the Lord saying, send them a note, by all means, send them a note. But if you're not close to them, don't call them. Check in with the people that are closest to them and see how you can help. That's the best advice I can give people.
Yep. That's good. And I want to touch back on, earlier you had said, and I know this is kind of changing subjects pretty quickly, but you had gone out into the woods and you screamed. Yeah. And that was your way of, like we had talked about, going through that pain, walking towards the darkness, because you felt like, as I do that, as I process that, the light is a lot closer than trying to chase that light, which seems so impossible.
Right.
And so I feel like this would be a subject or kind of a rabbit trail to kind of go on that might be interesting.
Oh, yeah.
How do you feel Hume played a part in your process of, coping?
I don't think I don't know. I have to be careful how I say this, because I know if we'd have been somewhere else, we would have gotten through it. But it was amazing. I still look back, and April and I both say it was the community at Hume that were those 4 buddies that carried their friend to Jesus.
Wow.
It was a very tight-knit community. And when I say that, you're just around. Everybody knows your stuff up there.
Sure.
And most of the time you're like, yeah, this is just a little bit too much of a fishbowl. But let me tell you what, that fishbowl came through for us.
Wow.
In such a clear way. my boss came over to my house that morning, and he said, Cliff, I've already talked to the main boss. You take as much time off as you need.
Wow.
I took a month off of work.
Wow.
I didn't go back to work for a month. And even when I did, I just kind of eased into it. And finally, April said, I need you to go back to work. I need you to not be around here every day. But it was so good because they just, on the employment side, they just said, do what you need to do to heal. On the friendship side, I mean, our meals were taken care of for that whole month.
Wow.
The house was clean. Every place along the way that community came through. It was such a biblical early Church of Acts kind of community that was walking through it with us. And for several people in that community, they really were willing to walk it with us.
Wow.
And to sit with us in the darkness and like I said, Job's buddies before they became jerks,
Yep. Amen. And
Amen.
I mean, with that and with COVID and with all of these different things that I think we've all kind of, faced in some sort of way, it just shows how important community is. It just shows how
Right.
important it is to be connected. Another word to use would be rooted. Somebody that is really engaged and influenced by a surrounding community that can encourage you to see hope, to see truth in Jesus, no matter what the situation. Now, that doesn't mean, pushing Jesus on somebody that can't necessarily process it correctly in the moment, in uncomfortable ways, but it does mean, being surrounded by people who are willing to serve, willing to, be by your side as you, handle that pain. What are some of your thoughts on that?
Community was so important, and I see people today that go through something like this and they don't have a strong community of Christ followers around them, and it is so hard for them. So that's such an important thing. Earlier on, you asked me the question about, is there anything you wished you had known ahead of time?
Mm-hmm.
And I think I would come back and say, I wished I had known how important having community was.
Yep.
I know now, and I would challenge anybody that, maybe you haven't gone through deep loss or grief. Be sure you have community around you, people that love Jesus and love you. And, it starts by you investing into them.
Yeah.
And they invest into you and back and forth. Someone that you and I both know, a couple you and I both know, is Micah and Mackenzie Paul.
Yes.
And it was just back in May and June that their little newborn boy, Henry, almost lost his life.
Right.
I mean, he was on the edge of life for several weeks there. And it was so cool to watch the community of believers come around them and just walk with them and carry them through that season. And it was, I know the exact feeling because we went through it. So that's a huge challenge to everyone. You can't do this thing alone. You've got to humble yourselves and put yourself in a community surrounded with people that are, when times are going to be bad and tough, they're going to walk with you. And when times are tough for them, you're going to walk with them.
Along with that, I can't assume that everybody that is listening to this podcast is a Christian or a believer, so forth. What about the crowd that comes into the church on Sunday mornings and they just can't relate because their grief is too heavy on them? Is it more than just the Sunday morning service that can heal them? What does that look like for them?
Yeah, that's good. This morning I was you and I are recording this on a Sunday. I was at church this morning, and I walked past a room in kind of the back annals of the church there, and inside the room was a group meeting called Griefshare. And and Griefshare is this ministry that we have at our church, and it's kind of a national ministry, and we have a local group that meets there. But they go through a 13-week curriculum, for lack of a better word, on walking through grief. And I almost popped in the room to say hello to them, because that's what a good pastor does, right? While there's a class going on, you pop in the room and wave at everybody, and hey, how y'all doing today?
Yeah, it's like the principal that walks in the classroom.
Yeah, and I thought better of that, and I looked in the window, and there is the facilitator of the group, Dave Crossan, who I so respect, talking, and then I look over, and there's someone just in tears, sharing their grief walk. And these are people that some of them don't have that community that you and I were just talking about, and maybe don't have that natural group of friends.
Right.
But they were prompted, maybe by someone close to them, to get involved and go do Griefshare. And what they end up finding is so many other people that are going through it also, and that are struggling, that are in pain, and they are grieving together. And it is such a beautiful thing. So to go back to what the original question, for someone that's sitting out there, just comes on a Sunday morning, doesn't have connection, when you're in deep grief, sometimes you have to make that. This is one of those leaning into the darkness kind of moves. Is you need to reach out and say, to a group like Griefshare, and say, I need to be in this because I'm a mess. And I need help. It's throwing up the white flag of surrender and saying, I can't figure this out.
Yep.
And that's my challenge to someone that doesn't feel connected, is look as hard as you can, and be that persistent. What was it? The persistent widow? Who was the one in Scripture that kept bothering the king? I don't think she was a widow. She was a mother or something like that. But she kept bothering the king. It's a parable.
Yes.
I'm showing my weakness in my pastoring right now. But she was so persistent that the king eventually was like, fine. The parable is about us being more fervent in prayer and so on. But that's where I just challenge people, like, you got to cry out for help.
Yeah.
And, Tanner, you and I both know someone who went through a tremendous amount of grief when I think you were a freshman or a sophomore, a young man that had lost his father.
Yes.
Just a tragic accident. And shortly after it had happened, I reached out to him, and we were hanging out a little bit. But I got really busy, and I hadn't taken any time to spend with him. And his mom called me, and she said, I need you to spend time with my son. He needs a man in his life. You need to do this.
Wow.
But she was fighting for her son.
Love her.
And for his health. and he and I have subsequently had some amazing times connecting together. But I really appreciated that she saw where the need was and grabbed the bull by the horns and did everything she could to make that happen. And so sometimes we have to advocate for ourselves in that. Sometimes we have to advocate for those that are close to us too.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I think some final touches on this. It's important to analyze. It's important to see and realize that there's people around you that have dealt with loss that are still, dealing with that. Like we had talked about earlier, you never get over it. You just start to kind of get used to it. And I think that that's an important, difference to understand, because, people still have those mental scars with anything. It doesn't even have to be about loss. People have mental scars. And, with that being said, that goes along with how we, treat them, how we act around them, whether it's even just, one moment of a slip up, of even just saying sarcasm about something, and that can somehow trigger some emotion that they've dealt with for
Yeah.
a long time. And so looking at your own personal life, seeing how you've gotten, not over this, but that you've gotten used to it. What are some final, encouragement or words that you can give, to my audience today?
So if you're around someone that has gone through loss and they are obviously grieving, one of the worst things you can do is to pretend that it doesn't exist. To be afraid that if you acknowledge their loss, it's going to resurrect emotion. That it's going to cause them to go to a bad place. The truth is, when we lost our daughter, we were, and literally for years after this, Tanner, this is on our minds every single day.
Wow.
Not necessarily every single hour, but there's not a day that goes by where I don't think of my daughter Elise. And now with my younger children, and I have now 3 children who never knew her. And as they desire to get to know her, that brings up the opportunity to tell stories, showing her video. We have a video that was made of her, of all the pictures and so on. And just every single day, my youngest daughter, Amelia, asks to watch the video of baby Elise, and it's an opportunity to help her get to know Elise better. But kind of my point was, there's never a day that goes by where I don't have some memory of Elise. And sometimes it's just remembering her. Sometimes it's remembering the trauma that we went through that day. Sometimes it's celebrating the recovery. Sometimes it's celebrating running a half marathon. And sometimes it's the half marathon that I really did well in a year later because I was 40 pounds less than I am today. Things like that. But not a day goes by where that person isn't thinking at some point about the loss.
Yeah.
So don't hide it. Don't hide around it. Don't be afraid that if you acknowledge that person, that you're going to stir up a bunch of emotion. That's okay. That's with them. That's part of them. It becomes part of their story. Yeah. And, when somebody says, hey, Cliff, would you, sometime be willing to tell me a little bit more about Elise? Like I get Greg Triplett, who, you remember Greg,
Yep.
He was one of the pastors at our church. One day he said, can we go out to lunch sometime and can you tell me more about Elise? I can't even tell you what that meant from somebody who had never known her, never saw her on the face of this earth, but he cared enough to want to get to know her a little bit.
Yeah.
And it's one of the reasons Greg is still one of those guys I look at as having been a great friend in my life.
Greg is awesome. Greg is awesome.
So that's my challenge. And, like I said earlier, I was talking about this concentric circle or the circles,
Yeah.
After time goes by, some of those circles start to blur a little bit. And that's where, we started. When we came to Sunrise, nobody at Sunrise knew about our daughter.
Yep.
And so we were joyful at the opportunity of being able to tell people about her. And, as time starts to separate your experience with her or, whoever that is that you lost, you start to get really encouraged when people want to hear more about it. So, that's a big challenge I have to people is the loss is always with them. And most of us that have gone through it, we're willing to talk about it.
That's awesome, brother. I appreciate you coming on, sharing this incredible testimony. And I tell you, I'm more than excited to meet your daughter one day in the kingdom.
That's right. I love it.
Thank you so much for joining us, man. I
Hey,
appreciate
Tanner,
you.
I sure appreciate you having me on. What a joy to be able to talk about her. And I love what God's doing in your life, and just excited to see him continuing to move in you. So thank you for doing this. Thanks for having me on.
Praise Jesus. Love you, brother. Thanks a lot. Man, what an incredible, incredible story. That story touches my heart so much. Every single time that I've heard it, it just warms my heart. Even though it is a story that is sad and it is, unfortunate to go through, Cliff's heart, his character, who he is, if you know Cliff, you know that he is one of the most genuine, loving, kind-hearted people that you will ever meet. And just seeing that, this guy went through thick and thin, with his family, with his wife, with people surrounding him. He powered through the darkness because he realized how close the light was. It's true. We can't always get over things, but we can get used to things. And that's encouraging. As we look forward and we know that there's an expectation of things to come that are going to stink. We may not know the strength of the sting, of that pain that you go through, but you can expect that there will be pain to come. And as we find ourselves building our house on the rock, as we find ourselves rooting ourselves into Jesus, really digging into the character and the goodness of God and his promises, you are able to see the hope, the truth, the light. You recognize that Cliff was in this place where community was so strong. He even compared it at one point, to the church of Acts, and that closeness, that unity that is just so powerful when you're surrounded by a community that is so filled with that same joy and that same light as you. You're able to get through things a lot easier. Now, I'm not suppressing the pain and the hurt that Cliff and April went through, but like he even said himself, Hume and being surrounded by that community helped him for the long run and allowed him to be surrounded by godly people, like Christ-like people, that are able to help him out and pray and just surround them with service. Guys, if you have made it this far in the episode, I just want to thank you so much. And if you could, please support us in terms of sharing, liking, following, posting it on your social media pages, whatever it might be. That would just bless my heart so much. If you could just share the Vision Project, not so that I can get, reputation or have the spotlight on me or recognition or whatever it might be, but so that Jesus can get the spotlight, and so that Jesus and his stories and the stories that he's working through people like this can be spread and noticed, so that people may know Jesus, that they can see the true refining of the gospel, that they can see the gift of salvation that they are offered, this free gift, that we don't have to work and earn that salvation by working for it, but that we can just surrender ourselves to him and live under that sacrifice, that gracious sacrifice that he gave to us. You guys, I'm speechless for how this podcast went. I'm looking forward to the next Testimony Tuesdays and the next episodes here on the VP podcast. I hope you guys are too. But for now, we'll see you guys in the next episode.